think most. I'm still Rhonda Hager. I currently serve as the team leader for Adult Ed. And today we're, as part of our 50th anniversary, this is an event sponsored by Adult Ed. The next 50th anniversary event will be Friday, June 17th, a Bluegrass Shabbat. And Tuesday, July 19th will be beer tasting. And Adult Ed, the next event is Saturday, June 11th, Real Night. The movie will be Syrian Bride. And we're looking for ideas for next year because we'll be meeting soon to plan the calendar for next year. And you can just contact me directly or send it to adulted@brithachim.org. And I'd like to turn it over to Rabbi Lazar, who will introduce Rabbi Gold. Thank you.
So good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. Just a few brief comments about Rabbi Gold from his personal bio, and then I'll share a very brief personal reflection, and then we'll go into the heart of this afternoon. So Rabbi Gold teaches and writes about Jewish texts, Israel, and the intersections between Jewish spiritual life and the contemporary world. In 2020, he created a rapidly expanding online platform for adult Jewish learning called A Tree with Roots. He teaches for Meah, a program of Hebrew College in Massachusetts, and he serves as the Jewish chaplain and Hillel director at Babson College. Neil is the immediate past president of the Massachusetts Board of Rabbis. In 2021, he became a JJGI, J.J. Greenberg Institute for Advancement of Jewish Life Fellow at Hadar Institute in New York. He was ordained from the Hebrew Union College and Jewish Institute of Religion in 2018. I'm sorry, no, way before that, sorry, got two sentences mixed together. And in 2018, he earned a second master's degree. He was ordained just a couple of years before 2018. He got his second master's in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies from Brandeis. He's the author of many academic and popular writings about Judaism and Israel. And most recently, he is the editor of Radiance, the collected prose and poetry of Danny Siegel, published by the Jewish publication. There you go. Yeah. Those of you who may remember, some of you may remember meeting Danny Siegel when he was our scholar in residence a couple of years ago. I met Danny Siegel through Neil a million years ago back in New Jersey. For over 18 years, he has served congregations in New Jersey and Massachusetts. He also served as the director of content and programming for ARTSA, the Association of Reformed Zionists of America, and was a delegate at the 37th World Zionist Congress in Jerusalem. His writing and blogging on issues of Jewish interest and his teaching schedule, both online and in person, can be found at his website, neilgold.net. Neil lives in Massachusetts with his wife Heidi and their children Avi and Jeremy. He enjoys fishing, writing, Talmud, playing bass guitar, yoga, and highly amplified music. So my personal reflection is that I was at Neil's home in New Jersey a million years ago when his first son Avi was born. I was there for the bris, and he was just floating on a cloud through the house. And someone said to him, "Are you getting any sleep?" And his answer was, "Who wants to sleep? This is so amazing." And that's my sense of Neil. Everything that happens in life is just too amazing to let it pass by without noticing and sanctifying and really appreciating. And I learned that from Neil. So I'm so glad to call you a teacher and colleague and friend. And I'm really glad that you're here with us today. And I'm looking forward to hearing all your stories and learning along with everybody else. And now I'm going to let Neil take over.
Oh, you're the best. Thank you for that introduction. Listen, everybody, first of all, I want you to know that I love your rabbi. And I adore him, and we've been friends for a long, long time. Eric, I want to say, you remember that bris that was at my parents' house, right? That you mentioned. That boy graduated from college from American University last weekend. So, for what that's worth, let me tell you something else about Rabbi Lazar. Like he mentioned, he and I have been friends for a long time, and I admire him in so many ways, especially as one of the most gifted teachers and Pied Pipers of Jewish education who I know. Um, we're both New Jersey expatriates, although he left New Jersey a couple of years before I did. And I promised him that I would mention this at the beginning of my presentation today. When he moved out of New Jersey, I said to him, you know, I always loved that license plate that you had on your car in New Jersey. I just thought it was so cool. He had this Tikkun Olam license plate. And soon after he moved out of New Jersey, I got this gift in my office. And it was his license plate. And I've kept it to this day. And I keep it like in my office. When I've had students come by my office, they always say, my God, that is so cool. And just proof that I've still held on to it, Rabbi. And I look at it all the time. And when I do, I think of you with all sorts of good feelings. The Tikkun Olam license plate.
And
So that's that.
every time I get stopped for no license plate on the car, I always say, my friend Neil, and they go, oh, okay.
It's hanging in the rabbi's office, right? That's very funny. And my thanks not just to Rabbi Lazar, but to Sharon Foreman Toll, and to Rhonda, and to Mark, and to everyone who made this event happen. It is interesting doing a hybrid event. Let me say that right off the bat. Since this pandemic began, I've done a couple of hybrid events, but usually not like this. Usually I'm in the room with the people who are there in the room, and then there's some people who are Zooming in. It is very strange to me to be doing a hybrid event in which I'm the one Zooming in, along with some of the others. So we're going to make the best of this as we can, because I have some stories and some material I want to share with you. But my natural environment when I teach is to teach through conversation and discussion and question and answers. So even though it's a little bit awkward when we're in a hybrid situation like this, I want everybody to kind of drop the awkwardness and to feel comfortable to ask questions, to interject, to answer the questions that I'm going to ask of you. And we'll try to figure out how to make the awkwardness of a hybrid Zoom and in-person event as least awkward as possible. Okay, I think that's my preliminaries. I want to say we're going to talk a little bit about Israel today. That's what brings us together. And let's note that today is a significant date. Today is May 15th, 2022. That means 74 years ago, on May 15th, 1948, Americans woke up, got their morning paper, and read some extraordinary things. Well, I could show you some of the extraordinary things that they saw in the morning paper 74 years ago today. The New York Times looked like this. And at the top of the page was this headline that said, Zionists proclaim new state of Israel. Truman recognizes it, hopes for peace. Tel Aviv is bombed. Egypt orders an invasion, independence, and war happening simultaneously. And that was the news that American Jews and everyone else woke up to on that particular morning. But that's not the newspaper that I really wanted to share with you. I wanted to share with you something else. As I've given you a little bit of show and tell about my home office, I showed you the license plate, but I want to show you something different. Also from May 15th, 1948. This is one of my prized possessions. It hangs over my desk in my office. I look at it every single day. I'll show you. What this is an American Yiddish daily paper from the first half of the 20th century. It's called Der Tag. Der Tag means the day in Yiddish. I don't know if there's anyone on the call who's old enough to remember daily Yiddish papers in America or Der Tag. There's probably not. But I want to tell you about how I got this and how it ended up behind the glass. This particular text, this particular newspaper I got from my grandfather. My grandfather passed away in 1993. He was a public school teacher in Newark, New Jersey, and he was a real pack rat. He kept everything. So for at least 10 years after he passed away, my grandmother was cleaning out closets of all sorts of stuff that he had acquired and accumulated over the years. Old spelling tests from his students from the 1960s, things like that, things no one would ever want. And we go to my grandmother's house. She'd reach back into the closet and often would come up with something with, and her stock line was, "Do you want this? I'm just going to throw it out." And she would come up with things like a bottle of Slivovitz from 1971 or stuff like that. One day she comes up with this old newspaper and she sticks in my hands. "I don't know why he saved these things. Do you want this? I'm just going to throw it out." And I took it and I looked closely at what it was, and then I realized what it was. It was the newspaper he saved from the day of Israeli independence. And I don't have too much Yiddish, but I have enough to and I've stared at this front page so many times that I've kind of figured out what it says. How it says in the big letters at the top, Idisha Malucha, Jewish state. And below that, it says, Anerkannt von America, recognition from America, Ben Gurion proklamiert Idischen Staat Yisrael. Ben Gurion proclaims the Jewish state, Yisrael. And I realized that my grandfather was saving that for me. By the way, it was just a newspaper crumpled up and in the back of a closet. I'm the one who took it, realized what it was, and framed it and put it behind glass so I could do things like share it with you today. It's exciting to me because I am certainly not old enough to remember that time in 1948, but it gives me a little bit of a taste, a little bit of a window into the extraordinary awe that American Jews and Jews all around the world must have felt waking up that morning and knowing that a new chapter of Jewish history was being written right there before our very eyes. And when we celebrate these anniversaries of the State of Israel, I try to reclaim a little bit of that awe and wonder, which gets progressively harder sometimes if you get a little bit too wrapped up in the news or in the way that Israel's portrayed in the media. So what I propose that we do today is talk about this anniversary. And specifically, this is an anniversary of the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. I think the Declaration of Independence of Israel is an extraordinary document, one that we should be more intimately familiar with. Frankly, I believe that generations from now, people will study the Declaration of Independence as one of the key texts of Jewish history. I also think it's worthwhile because when times are tough, which seems to be often, but especially this was a tough week for lovers of Israel and things that unfolded in the media, it's sometimes worth returning to first principles as espoused in a document like the Declaration of Independence, to remind ourselves of what the nation's deepest aspirations are. And frankly, also for us to be able to encourage and to share in the endeavor of creating an Israel that lives up to those highest ideals. So for the people who are on the Zoom screen, I have shared in the chat access to the document that I prepared of the Declaration of Independence. Do the people in the sanctuary all have those texts? I can't tell. Yay or nay?
Yes, we have it.
Oh, okay, great, Rhonda, thank you. We're not quite going to look at them yet, but I wanted to make sure that they're handy, because eventually that's what we're going to want to do. We're going to want to study the text as like a piece of Torah. Okay. First, I want to share with you a bit of history about how this document came to be. And I happen to think that this is a pretty great story. So I'm going to tell the story. It's going to take me a little while to get the story out of how the Declaration of Independence came to be, because I'm going to have a lot of asides and visual aids that I want to share with you. But I hope you enjoy this, because I think the story is a pretty wondrous story in and of itself. So we start not on May 14th, but we start on 6 months earlier, on November 29th, 1947. That was the date that the United Nations cast its historic vote on Resolution 181, which was the resolution that partitioned Palestine into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. The vote that story is extraordinary in and of itself, but it's a little bit of too big of a digression for today. But that vote required 2/3 majority of the 56 states that made up the United Nations at that time in 1948. On radios around the Jewish world, people were tuned in and listened to the roll call of nations voting yes or no on whether this partition of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state should go forward. And the final vote of the UN General Assembly was 33 in favor, 13 against, 10 abstentions, and 1 absent. That was a Friday night, and some synagogues in America stayed open late that evening as Jewish communities gathered to listen to the vote as it unfolded, to rejoice, to celebrate, in some places to recite Hallel prayers of thanksgiving and celebration. And this is the map that the United Nations approved in that vote. It does not look like the map of Israel today. What we have in this map is the green areas. Those are the borders of the proposed Jewish state. Note how small it is. Note how much of what we come to know as contemporary Israel is not part of those boundaries. This was the area where most of the Jewish population had settled, plus this entire area of the Negev in the south, which in 1948, which was largely desolate and empty. The orange areas here are the proposed Arab state. Everything including the west bank of the Jordan River, the area around Gaza and bordering Egypt. And what you can't tell from this map is everything here on the east bank of the Jordan River. That's the modern nation of Jordan. All of that was delegated to the Palestinian Arabs. This was the first two-state solution to the crisis of two peoples living in this space. Each of those peoples with a compelling narrative, each of those peoples with a genuine and honest claim to the land. And tragically, it followed the history of all subsequent two-state solutions as well. And that is the Jewish leadership largely accepted it and endorsed it, even though there were radicals among them who didn't accept it. And the Arab leadership largely condemned it and rejected it, even though there were some voices that dissented from that. So with that in mind, now it's that interesting time between 1947 and 1948. In the months following the United Nations vote, it was determined that the British mandate over Palestine was to come to an end. The British had been administering that area to a limited degree of success since the end of World War I. In fact, the British couldn't wait to wash their hands of the Jews and the Arabs quickly enough. As the spring grew warmer, the British withdrawal came nearer and nearer. In fact, it was unexpectedly pushed forward to midnight on May 15th, 1948. In fact, that pushing the date sooner took a lot of people by surprise. The Provisional Zionist Government, which was led by David Ben-Gurion, decided it was now or never to declare statehood. Let's check out Ben-Gurion for a second on our screen. Oh, there's Ben-Gurion in all of his glory. He's a fascinating figure, Ben-Gurion. On one hand, a socialist, secular Jew. On the other hand, a deep thinker and deep aficionado of Jewish history with a deep passion for Jewish books and for archaeology of the land of Israel. He was an iconoclast in all sorts of ways, because in the lower left-hand corner, that's a famous iconic picture of Ben-Gurion. There's a statue of Ben-Gurion standing on his head on the Tel Aviv beach that you can still visit today. That's because he was an early practitioner of yoga. He was fascinated by India and the East, and was a practitioner of yoga before everybody was doing yoga. So Ben-Gurion is the leader of the state that's in waiting. And they decided that with the British leaving at midnight on May 15th, it was now or never to declare statehood. This, by the way, was against the will of the United States State Department, who in private channels tried to tell Ben Gurion, please don't do this. We need more time to get prepared for everything that's about to happen. But see, here's what I like about this story. If you've ever rushed to finish a project or a final exam or a final paper for a professor in college, and if you've ever rushed to do that at the last minute, consider this. On May 11th, the Zionist leadership realized that the British authority was coming to an end. They had 3 days to put together not only the Declaration of Independence, but also to prepare a ceremony signing and announcing the Declaration of Independence to the Jewish people and to the world. 3 days, you might say, you've waited 2,000 years for this and you didn't get any. That's why I think it's like, preparing for a final exam. Oh, you had all semester, but the night before you have to stay up all night and cram for it. So it makes that look kind of banal to say you have 3 days to do the Declaration of Independence and to plan the ceremony. Why 3 days and not 4 days? Because May 15th, 1948 was a Saturday. And therefore, they decided that independence would be announced at 4 o'clock on the afternoon of May 14th. Why? This is the part where if I were in the room with you, it'd be a little easier to do, but I'm going to ask questions like that. Feel free to unmute yourself or to call it out or to come up to the microphone. Why the British were leaving midnight on Saturday, May 15th, independence would be signed Friday afternoon, May 14th. How come?
I take a try. Too hard to get people together on Shabbat.
Shabbat is the answer. I don't know about it being too hard, but yeah, because of Shabbat, that among other things, there was a religious constituency. Even though most of the Zionist leaders were secular, there's a religious constituency, and this sort of business, even the business of announcing the birth of the state of Israel, shouldn't be performed on Shabbat. Otherwise, you'd lose a significant constituency who would object to that. So picture this. You got 3 days until Friday at 4 o'clock, and that's a hard stop because the sun is going to set and Shabbat's going to arrive. With that hard deadline, this is where the intensity kind of ratchets up. On Wednesday, May 12th, a surreal race against the clock begins. A group of 13 people, a special committee called the Minahelet Ha'am, the National Administration, gathers to hammer out the Declaration of Independence. They met in Tel Aviv in order to draft and to argue over what should actually be the wording of this Declaration of Independence. And there were people they were Jews from a wide variety of backgrounds. So that should say everything you need to know about the intensity of the debate and the arguing that must have ensued about what the message of the text should be. See, the first crazy thing about all of this is every question, even the most obvious ones that you and I take for granted, was at that time, in fact, still up for grabs. For instance, what was this new state going to be called? It was not obvious that it was going to be called Israel. Israel was historically the name of the Jewish people and the land of Israel, not the state. So we're going to talk more about that question in a little while. Secondly, what would be the official language of this state? Not only was there a significant part of the citizenry that was primarily Arabic speakers, but reflect for a moment on what a marvel modern Hebrew is. The rebirth of modern Hebrew is a whole other topic and a lecture and study session unto itself. But remember that none of the signers of the Declaration of Independence spoke Hebrew as their first and native language. In fact, some of them stammered through it with no small amount of difficulty. They were all primarily Yiddish speakers or Russian speakers or German speakers or Arabic speakers. So it was not obvious that Hebrew would be the official language of this country. Thirdly, perhaps the stickiest hurdle of all, if you're writing the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, should we mention God? Remember that many of the Zionist leaders were ardently secular people. Many of them outright objected to having the word God in the document and insisted that they should not. Some of the socialist secular leaders who were the shapers of this moment insisted that they should not be forced to proclaim, I believe in religion or in God, against their will. They said, that's exactly the sort of thing I was leaving Europe for. And on the other hand, there were quite religious members of the committee who argued that any document signed on behalf of the Jews of the world absolutely could not omit the divine name. How could you imagine such a thing? In this argument, we might say that the battle for the religious soul of Israel had already begun. So those are just three examples. What's the new state going to be called? What's its language going to be? Should we mention God? Those are just three examples of the challenges that this committee had to deal with, and they had to deal with it quickly. Okay, back to the story. Planning the ceremony for the Declaration of Independence was left to Zev Sharif, a fascinating figure and pretty unknown and forgotten figure in Zionist history. He was the secretary of the National Administration, and he recorded this entire frenzy that I'm telling you about now in his memoir, which in English is called 3 Days. Here's a look at the invitation that went out. You can see that, yes? This is the invitation that went out to about 350 political leaders, communal leaders, journalists, heads of the Jewish Agency and the World Zionist Organization, and other notable guests. Each invitation announced that the state was going to be declared on Friday at 4 p.m. at the Museum of Tel Aviv at 16 Rothschild Boulevard. But the best part of the invitation, look how like plain and no frills the invitation is. The best part is this line right here that I'm circling with my cursor. Oh no, actually this part, the second to last line. Anu mevakshim lishmor basod et hatochen ha'azmana ve'et moed kinus hamotza. We request that you respect the secrecy of this invitation and keep secret the timing of the gathering when this is going to take place. In other words, don't tell anyone the date or the time about what's going to happen. How do you think that went over? Yeah, you can imagine. So that's germane to this story too. Everybody, please, 3 days time, we're going to declare the establishment of the state of Israel, but please don't tell anybody. Keep it a secret. Okay, the committee's hammering out the declaration. On Thursday night, Ben-Gurion takes home the draft that the committee's been working on for 2 days, and he essentially rewrites the entire thing. On that late night, Ben-Gurion takes matters into his own hands. We make some, shall we say, executive decisions so that the Declaration of Independence would be finalized. He shortened it extensively. He trimmed some of its flowery language. He resolved the God crisis, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Friday morning, the council gathers one last time to finalize the document. They look over what revisions Ben-Gurion has made. The wording was finally agreed upon at 3:00 p.m. that Friday, 1 hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin on the opposite side of town in Tel Aviv. At 3 p.m., the committee adjourns, and all the delegates rush home to change their clothes and get ready and get over to the museum for the event. Zev Sharif, the secretary, remains behind with a secretary to quickly type up the final draft of the declaration. There was no time to have it formally inscribed by a calligrapher. All of that would happen later. So then, with the only extant copy of the draft of the Declaration of Independence in his hand, Sharif steps out onto the street of Tel Aviv, and disaster struck. You see, Sharif was the logistics man. It was his job to take care of all the details and the arrangements of the ceremony that was unfolding. But he forgot one thing. He forgot to arrange a car for himself to get across town from where they were drafting the document to the Museum of Tel Aviv, where the ceremony was taking place. And worse, there's no taxis to be found in Tel Aviv on Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock. How come? Not because of Shabbat. Tel Aviv's a pretty secular place. How come? Because the entire city was home, glued to their radios, because the top secret signing of the Declaration of Independence was about to take place. Everybody had to be home in order to participate in it and hear it. So, Zev Sharif flags down the first car that he sees, which is being driven by a teenage boy. He stops the boy and says, "Take me to this address." The boy says, "Mister, I can't take you anywhere. I have to get home in time to hear the Declaration of Independence be read over the radio." Sharif says, "Listen, if you don't get me to this address right away, there isn't going to be a declaration, because this is it." So he gets into the car and they speed off. So they're rushing across town to the Museum of Tel Aviv to sign the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, and a policeman pulls them over for speeding. This is the moment when Sharif discovered that the car he was in was a borrowed one, to put it nicely, and the driver was underage and driving without a license. The British cop pulls them over and tries to give them a speeding ticket, and they essentially say to him, "You can't give us a ticket, because there is no government authority behind that ticket, because the mandate government that issues it is about to cease to exist." And the cop thinks about it for a minute, agrees, and lets them go. At 3:59 p.m., Zev Sharif, I imagine a little bit flustered, walks into the ceremony. He goes up to the table and hands David Ben-Gurion the Declaration of Independence. Ben-Gurion immediately takes the document, stands up, strikes the table with his gavel, and calls the meeting to order. And he begins to read the text of the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. It took him 17 minutes to read its 979 words in Hebrew. And then, after he finishes reading it, he turns to the man sitting next to him, who's a rabbi named Yehuda Leib Fishman. And Rabbi Fishman rises and he recites the Shehechianu blessing, the blessing that we say for reaching milestones in our lives. And it just kind of strikes me that it must have been perhaps the most extraordinary Shehechianu recited by anybody in 2,000 years. Thanking God for bringing us to this moment, the re-entry of the Jewish nation onto the world stage. I mean, it's just amazing. And one of the things that's amazing about it is that we have documentation of all this in a way that, imagine as you study US history, it seems so long ago. You know, imagine you had a audio transcript of the founders in Philadelphia talking about signing about ratifying the US Constitution or signing the Declaration of Independence. Well, this was only 74 years ago. So it exists. And I'd like to play you a little snippet of those final words from the Declaration, and then Rabbi Fishman's most extraordinary Shehechianu in 2,000 years of Jewish history. Check this out. The whole thing is available here online, but I'm just going to go to that part at the end.
Israel. מתוך ביטחון בצור ישראל, הננו חותמים בחתימת ידינו לעדות על הכרזה זו במושב מועצת המדינה הזמנית על אדמת המולדת בעיר תל אביב, היום הזה, ערב שבת, אייר תש"ח, 14 במאי 1948, לקבל את מגילת היסוד למדינת היהודים בעמידה. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו והתגדלנו והגענו לזמן הזה.
I just think that is so cool that that document exists, that we can hear. I hope you could hear that just now when I shared it, of the most amazing Shehechianu perhaps ever uttered. After they said the Shehechianu, just a couple of things to bring this story full circle. Then the delegates came forward one by one to sign the document. What is it that they signed? Well, basically they signed a blank piece of parchment that was paper clipped to the typewritten text. Later on, a scroll would be done in fancy calligraphy and it would look professional. But in the meantime, they were basically signing a blank page that would then be sewn to the calligraphy document with needle and thread. One by one, they signed this document. Can you imagine what it must have felt like to be a signatory to this moment in Jewish history? I mean, the early Zionists who were building up the land, they thought of themselves as writing the next chapter of the Bible. That this is the story of the unfolding saga of Jewish history. Imagine the awe and no small amount of trepidation of what it felt like to sign that document. Once again, here's the words of one of its signatories, Golda Meir. She said, "From my childhood in America, I learned about the Declaration of Independence and the geniuses who signed it. I couldn't imagine that these were real people doing something real. And here I am, signing it, actually signing a Declaration of Independence. I didn't think it was due me that I, Goldie Maybovich Meyerson, deserved it, that I'd lived to see the day. My hands shook. We had done it. We had brought the Jewish people into existence. Whatever price any of us would have to pay for it, we had recreated the Jewish national home. The long exile was over. Now we were a nation like other nations, masters for the first time in 20 centuries of our own destiny. All I can recall about my actual signing of the proclamation is that I was crying openly, not able even to wipe the tears from my face. When David Pincus, another signatory, asked me why I was crying, I said, 1, because of the honor, and 2, because there are people missing here who had more of a right to be here and sign than I did." Pretty awesome when history strikes our reality, our lives, like that. Just one more fun story about what happened that day. After the last signature was put onto the page, the Philharmonic Orchestra was signaled to play the Hatikva, the new national anthem. Because the room was overcrowded with guests who had come to this secret ceremony, the orchestra was at the last minute relocated to the second floor of the building, and they had no direct eye contact with the people on the stage. So therefore, what had been arranged was there was a young boy who had the job of ringing a buzzer to let them know when it was time to play Hatikva. But the young boy missed his cue. The story goes that he had inadvertently gotten locked in the toilet. So therefore, nobody was there to cue the orchestra when it was time to play. Somehow the musicians got the message anyway. And for the first time, Hatikva was sung as the anthem of the state of Israel. And as the music died down, Ben Gurion struck the table with his gavel and said, The state of Israel is established. This meeting is adjourned. And after 1,878 years in exile, ceremony took 32 minutes and a Jewish state was born. So I do love telling that story. But now I want us to take a look at the text itself and see what it says. Because like I mentioned earlier, I do believe that the Declaration of Independence is a document worthy of study, looking closely at why certain words and phrases were chosen. And I suggest that generations from now, Jews will read this document and study it like other Torah texts from our history as one of the key documents in all of Jewish life. So this would be a good time to take it out for those who are in the room to take out the texts. And for those who are online, hopefully you were able to get it from me as I put it in the chat there. I'd initially struggled with how I wanted to do this. Part of my original thought was to kind of put people into small study groups and to read and wrestle with these, especially because so many of the Zoom screens are off, though. I was thinking that maybe we'll make it one group, but you have to volunteer to talk and ask questions and to answer my questions. And I also would like to invite some people to read certain passages from the Declaration. So if you're game, and I hope you are, I'm going to ask, people in the sanctuary, if you're comfortable and want to volunteer, just come on up to the microphone. And people who are online, probably the best way to do this is to click the reactions button on the bottom of your screen, and you'll see something that says raise hand. And then I'll be able to see you and call on you. So in this document, I've given you the entire Declaration of Independence here. We're not going to read all of it. It's for our short time together, but I've boxed out 4 different sections of it in different colors. And those are the sections that I want us to zoom in on. But I'll just say another word of introduction to this text. So things that we want to look at when we look at this text is how the framers decided to tell their story, and how they decide to justify, every Declaration of Independence, certainly the American Declaration of Independence, begins with a justification of its existence. When in the course of human events, the US Declaration begins, certain injustices have been perpetuated against us by the King of England, and we have decided that justice dictates that we need to be independent from England. So too, this document is going to say, why does the world need a state of Israel now, and on what foundations does it sit? So here we go. The scroll, as it was subsequently done by a calligrapher, is there on the left-hand side in Hebrew. And here's the official English there is an official English translation. That's where I got this from, the Israeli government site. And it starts by telling us that Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, political identity was shaped. Here they first attained statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom. So we have a bird's eye view of Jewish history that's presented here. It's always interesting to see which things are included and which things are neglected or left out of a story like this. But that's kind of not what I want to focus on right now. In fact, the first text I want us to zoom in on is the paragraph. I put a purple frame around it about halfway down on page 1. And is there a volunteer either in the room or online who would like to just read this paragraph for us?
I'll be glad to do it.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Danton, I see you. You'll be the next.
The
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. The catastrophe which recently befell the Jewish people, the massacre of millions of Jews in Europe, was another clear demonstration of the urgency of solving the problem of its homelessness by reestablishing in Eretz Israel, the Jewish state, which would open the gates of the homeland wide to every Jew and confer upon the Jewish people the status of a fully privileged member of the community of nations.
So what did we just say? What did she just read to us? I'm particularly interested in the way the text chooses to talk about the Holocaust. Because remember, this is 1958, that the Holocaust in 1948 is still a living, open wound in the Jewish community. There's been no settlement. There's been no, the war is over, but not all the refugees are not all settled. There's still displaced persons camps. But for that matter, the entire Jewish world is still bleeding from the fact that 1/3 of the population of the Jewish world has been murdered. And yet, on the other hand, Israel doesn't exist because of the Holocaust. The reason why I wanted to zoom in on this is to make the point that anyone that's something you hear a little bit too frequently from our detractors and from within the Jewish community as well, that Israel came into existence because of the Holocaust. I think any serious student of history and of Zionist history would see that there's a momentum and an inevitability, not an inevitability, but this momentum for the state of Israel had kind of reached the point of no return, certainly by the 1930s. It was coming to be, and there was a government in waiting that was already in place. But then the Holocaust did happen. So given that paragraph that we just read, how does the text choose to include the Holocaust in the story of why Israel comes to be? Let's take a look at the text again, and I'd love to hear some responses to that question. Do you think it was proper to mention the Holocaust at all in this document?
I would say that it's fair because, again, it was still recent, very fresh in everyone's mind. And secondly, a lot of individuals did become homeless because of it and needed a place to be able to, start their lives. This was a nation willing to accept those that had lost their homes because of it. Lost most of their, lost way too much to be just set aside.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. Thanks, Stanton. How do you say your name? Doey?
Yes, that's right.
Hi, nice to see you.
It's a nickname. One thing I'm noticing, and I thank you so much for making it easy for us to read this on our screens as well as in person.
Thanks for saying that.
The word another, it's another clear demonstration so that even without the Holocaust, there were demonstrations for sure of the urgency of solving the problem of the fact that the Jewish people had no national homeland. And it also included in this section is the fact that in the Jewish state, the gates would be open wide to every Jew, just the opposite of what had just happened in Europe, and of course had been happening for that 2,000 years in many places, that Jews were made stateless and were expelled from the countries where they were living, or realized that if they didn't leave on their own, they would be killed.
Thank you for saying that. And you said a mouthful. It happened in Palestine too. One of the legal things that this document does is it also rescinds the British white papers that had been in effect, which basically limited the number of Jewish refugees that were allowed to come to Palestine. So this that statelessness that you're talking about, Zoe, this addresses that as well. Thank you. Someone else? Mark? Yeah.
This is Mark. I'm noticing how soft this paragraph is. It's describing it, what happened in the Holocaust, as like it was a natural disaster. A catastrophe happened, just so happened to happen. It's not a paragraph of, the Nazis were killing our people and all the other countries of the world didn't provide a place for them to escape to. It's just a natural disaster.
I'm not sure if I agree with you about it being like a natural disaster, like an earthquake or whatever, but I do agree maybe it pulls its punches a bit, that this isn't a finger pointing document about the rest of the, maybe for good reasons, to the finger pointing to the rest of the world saying, you did this to us. This is why we're leaving, if you can imagine. I guess that would have been an option. And maybe there is a bit of pulling punches here.
But they refer to solving the problem of its homelessness and kind of pointing that as the bird's eye view of the biggest problem, that the Jewish people being homeless at that time was a stigma attached to it, and that people from all over the world were kind of look at it and say, those Jews, nobody wants them.
I hear you. I hear you. The homelessness. And so the conclusion from that, I think, is really interesting. What's the verb that we see here? I don't think it's a verb, actually. My English teachers would say it's actually a gerund, I suppose, but it doesn't say the construction of the state of Israel, the establishment of the state. What's the gerund that describes what they're doing here?
That was what I was noticing, the reestablishing.
Reestablishing. That's very important. And that's not accidental at all. That it's not we're creating something new. It's we're reestablishing something that was. Now, however you may feel about that, that's very much on purpose the way the Zionist tradition tries to tell its story. It is very much a response to people in contemporary times who accuse Zionism of being a form of European colonialism. However you may feel about that accusation, the Zionist narrative is very different from the narrative of like the English or the French or the Portuguese colonizing Africa or Asia or South America. That it's not the language of colonization, it's the language of A, going home, and B, of reestablishing what once was, which is very different from any sort of colonialism in the world that I know of. So I think this paragraph is really interesting for a whole bunch of reasons, including how it relates to history, specifically the recent history, the still open wound of the Shoah. It does make me think of the words, I'm going to paraphrase words of my teacher, Yossi Klein Halevi, who says, our relationship to the Holocaust in Israel is the Holocaust does not explain our connection to this place, our rootedness in this place. That comes from ancient history. That comes from all of Jewish history throughout the ages. The Holocaust does explain why we fight as fiercely as we do to stay here, because we've learned in Jewish history what the alternative is. So I think all of that kind of underlies this paragraph. I want to look at another one. Let's scroll down a little bit. In fact, let's go on to the top of page 2. The remainder of page 1 is continuing to tell this concise, adapted, adjusted history of the Jewish people up until this moment. Then we're going to make the case in the box that I've put on the screen in red at towards the top of page 2. There's gonna be a couple of interesting things here. I want us to zoom in on by what authority and what right do we establish this state? And then I want to take up the thorny question of the name of this place that we're establishing. So Danton, I think it's your turn. Will you read the red box for us that's on the screen?
Sure. Accordingly, we members of the People's Council, representatives of the Jewish community of Eretz Israel and of the Zionist movement, are here assembled on the day of the termination of the British mandate over Eretz Israel, and by virtue of our natural and historic right, and on the strength of the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel to be known as the State of Israel.
Thank you. So 2 things about this paragraph. One is, so by what authority do we, the writers of this document, claim to, what authority do we claim in order to do this, to issue this declaration?
Right there, by
Okay.
virtue of our natural historic right, right?
That's answer number 1. It's not the only answer that's here, but answer number 1 is natural and historic right, which means, again, I think it's like the anti-colonialism argument. We've always been here, or if we haven't always, there has been a continual Jewish presence in places in the land of Israel. But even for those of us who came over here from Russia 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, before this came into being, we still affirm our historic right that Jewish people for 1,000 years, when we've prayed, we've turned and prayed in the direction of Jerusalem. That this is the only home that we've ever staked our claim to. Okay, natural and historic right, whatever in the world that means. Is there another answer to this question also? By what authority? Doi.
Well, the United Nations General Assembly, and the United Nations had only been in existence for 3 years at that time.
Yeah. So also, if you don't like the Bible, or you don't care about Jewish history or Jews facing Jerusalem 3 times a day to pray, forget all that. They're also asserting we have a legal right to this place, as asserted by the United Nations. And earlier in the document, it mentioned the League of Nations, that kind of failed assembly of Woodrow Wilson's after World War I to kind of end war forever. Spoiler alert, it didn't work out. But the League of Nations adopted the Balfour Declaration, which said the Jewish people have a right to a state in this historic homeland. And the United Nations picked up on that legal precedent in 1947 when it voted to partition the state into 2 parts. So they say, all right, some people like the Bible, but if you don't like the Bible, forget about the Bible. How about legal precedent in these world bodies? I think it's important that it's kind of asserting both things, that it's asserting Jewish history, but Jewish history isn't the language that's going to convince much of, certainly not everybody. So it's also asserting the language of world opinion, world court, and the law. I think that's interesting. The thing that I think is most relevant to me, though, is this part. And this paragraph concludes with these words, to be known as the State of Israel. Remember when I was telling the story a little while ago, I said one of the big controversies was going to be, what was this new state going to be called? It was not obvious. In fact, it was not obvious 48 hours earlier that it was going to be called Israel. After all, Israel was historically the name of the Jewish people. Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. Israel was historically the name of the land, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. But it was not historically the name of any political body or state that ever existed. So before we talk a little bit about why they chose Israel, what were some what do you think an alternative name might have been? if you didn't go for Israel, what else would have been a good name for this new state? You get bonus points for being more creative. The more creative you are, the better. But what are some names that might have been if it weren't Israel? Go ahead, Zoe. I see your hand was raised. Go ahead. You're muted though.
I don't know which alternatives they actually considered, but perhaps Judah was one of them, because when, thousands of years ago, the land of Israel was divided into sections. One was called Israel, but it kind of disappeared, but the other was called Judah, and that's why we're called the Jews, I guess.
Absolutely. Right. For those two, that was a lead contender. A lot of people might have thought this place is going to be called Judah. Why? Because the last, we're trying to draw continuity here. The last Jewish government in this place was called the Kingdom of Judah. And for that matter, we're Jews. It's the Jewish state. The Jewish state should be named Judah. That's where we get Jewish from. So that would have been a natural call. And a lot of people pushed for that. Or a lot of people just thought that would naturally be the name. But it wasn't, for a variety of reasons. But give me some other options. I think somebody in the room called that out, but I couldn't hear it.
He said Palestine.
Palestine would have been continual, that it was, Palestine was named that place under the British Mandate. The problem is that they were cutting Palestine in half. That was the United Nations goal, into an Arab state and a Jewish state. So I think most people kind of figured that that name was being retired. But sure, I mean, even after the Declaration of Independence, the most famous, largest English language newspaper in that place was called the Palestine Post. It was only like 2 years later, I think, that it changed its name to the Jerusalem Post. So that's a good call. That's a possibility. What else?
What about Canaan? I mean, that is where Moses was originally taking the Israeli people, and the land of milk and honey, Canaan. I was wondering if that would have been an option.
Very biblical. That's the biblical name for this place. There's always the question, probably what sunk that idea was the question of boundaries. The Bible has very specific boundaries of what the land of Canaan is. And on one hand, it's far more expansive than what the what the Zionists were about to get. And on the other hand, what they were about to get there were parts of it like the Negev that weren't part of the biblical Canaan. So you can see why they talked themselves out of it, but you're right, that might have been a possibility as well. I'll throw two more in for you. How about, well, the most obvious. How about calling this place Zion? After all, what's the name of the movement that brought it into existence? Zionism, right? Wouldn't it make sense that the end result of Zionism would be the establishment of Zion? But it wasn't to be. Zion historically is a synecdoche for Jerusalem, and more specifically, it's the hilltop in Jerusalem that adjoins the Temple Mount. But some people may have argued that why isn't it called Zion? After all, the movement's called Zionism. And I'll add one more that didn't have very much traction at all. It sounds strange to our ear. What if this place was called Eber? Why would Eber be in it? What word that's very relevant do we get from Eber? We get Ivrit or Ivri, Hebrew, the language, or Ivri, a Hebrew person. The noun for that, I guess, is Eber, which comes from the book of Genesis as well. The founding father of modern Hebrew, Ben Yehuda, Eliezer Ben Yehuda, his son is quoted for commanding the mandate to spread the Hebrew language. He said, Ivri daber Ivrit, Hebrew person, speak Hebrew. So you could imagine that. Anyway, so in truth, this was one of those last minute decisions that Ben Gurion kind of made the executive call and said, we're calling it Israel. In fact, I didn't realize I was still sharing the screen. I do that sometimes when I get excited. Let me show you one other thing, that this was such a last minute call that even on May 14th, 1948, we have this document from the Americans that this is from Clark Clifford, who was one of President Harry Truman's foremost legal advisors, recalled that the name Israel was still unknown to the Americans on May 14th, 1948, at the time that the United States was drafting its recognition of the state. Most people assumed in the American government that the new state that was coming into existence was going to be called Judah. And so we have this document where it's kind of a draft of the letter that Harry S. Truman was going to send to Ben Gurion, wishing everybody congratulations and recognizing the new state. And it was written this way: the government has been informed that a Jewish state has been proclaimed in Palestine, and recognition has been requested by the government thereof. And then you see the word provisional government thereof, because there have been no elections. The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new, and you see it says the new Jewish state, because they just kind of took the generic, they didn't know what it was going to be called. And somebody, I don't know whose handwriting this is, crossed out Jewish state and wrote in state of Israel. Like we just got the word that it's going to be called Israel. So President Truman, when you send your official notification, be sure that you say that. Now we know what the name of the state is going to be. I think that's kind of fascinating. Okay, we're doing good. Let's see. Before we leave that topic, I do want to say one thing about why the name Israel was controversial in 1948. And it's controversial in some quarters because of what I said a few minutes ago, that Israel, historically, the name had referred to, it was an alternative name for the Jewish people. The Jewish people were called Am Yisrael. So some people in the diaspora were very concerned that what Ben Gurion was doing was co-opting the name of the Jewish people for his state. In other words, that by calling the state Israel, it would blur the lines between the Jewish state and the Jewish people, and therefore would give the impression to the world that the state of Israel, when it spoke for the Jewish people everywhere in the world, which is exactly what he was doing. So that's kind of some of the drama behind the name Israel, which was far from obvious, even 48 hours before this declaration was composed. Anybody have any other questions or comments or reflections on that before I go on to the next piece? Okay, so box number 3 in the green frame is the part that is perhaps the most aspirational part of the document. It's the part that people are most likely to quote when they quote from the declaration. It talks about the rights that are ensured. It was the rights that are ensured by the establishment of this new state. So let's read it. This is in many ways the most exciting, the most provocative, the most inspirational part of these words of this entire document, and in some ways the most important. Would somebody like to read this paragraph for us? I hope I didn't build it up too much. Great, thank you.
The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations.
So one of the things we see in this paragraph is the influence of important documents that had come beforehand, most especially the United States Declaration of Independence and the United States Bill of Rights. And I would argue that in some ways, I mean, you know, from the vantage point of 150 years later, in some ways, it goes beyond the United States Bill of Rights. How so? Well, you know, this guarantee of freedom of to everybody, but to everybody that's spelled out, including irrespective of religion, race, or sex. Wouldn't it be nice if the U.S. Bill of Rights itemized those things? You know, that it will that the civil liberties of the Bill of Rights, you know, famously, it's hard to criticize something that comes from the 18th century, you know, but famously it was written by, declares freedom for all, as long as you're a, you know, in a document that was framed by white landowning slaveholders, whatever, you know, that the 150 years later, picking up on those themes and going beyond it, the Israeli Declaration of Independence is able to guarantee rights to all of its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. Plus, it guarantees freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. One of the things that's weird is freedom of language. That didn't seem to be a problem for the US framers of the Constitution. But Israel wants to talk about freedom of language, I guess for an obvious reason. First of all, Hebrew is still slightly controversial in 1948. Like I mentioned before, even though these framers who believe that Hebrew is of value, they're still, a lot of them are still kind of uncomfortable in it. And secondly, we've got the question of half our population is this Arab population who Hebrew is not their native language or their spoken language at all. And to this day, or at least until some controversial laws that the Netanyahu government passed a couple of years ago, everything that was a legal official government document was in Hebrew and in Arabic as well. Street signs and other things, you know, that Arabic had sort of a equal status of Hebrew until relatively recently in Israel. And people who opposed that change cited this line in the Declaration of Independence itself. Of course, the United States doesn't have anything like this sentence or this phrase where it says it will safeguard the holy places of all religions. And that comes for obvious reasons, Jerusalem being this touchstone, not just for Judaism, but for Islam and Christianity as well. So that gets this pride of place in the document as well. I want to go on to one more thing for us, and that is, let's go to this orange box at the very end, which seems to be this concluding paragraph of the whole thing. But there's something really interesting that appears in this final paragraph as well. So one more reader for us today. Anyone want to jump in and read the paragraph in the orange frame for us? Someone, please. Rabbi. This is a good paragraph for you, Rabbi.
All right.
I'll tell you why.
Placing our trust in the Rock of Israel, we affix our signatures to this proclamation at this session of the Provisional Council of State on the soil of the homeland in the city of Tel Aviv on this Sabbath eve, the 5th day of ER 5708, 14th May 1948.
Now, Rabbi, why did I say this is a good paragraph for you? What's the interesting, slightly controversial thing about that paragraph that you just read? Did you hear it?
Rock of Israel.
You got it. So I mentioned
Tzur Yisrael.
what's that?
Tzur, I was just saying Tzur Yisrael.
Tzur Yisrael in Hebrew. Exactly right. So here is the question of, does God get mentioned in the Declaration of Independence? It threatened to derail the whole thing, that question, because I told you there was one or two Orthodox members of the council who said, we absolutely cannot create a document that speaks to this historical moment, speaks for all the Jewish people around the world and not mention God. If you do so, I won't sign such a document. And there were socialist Zionist leaders in the room that said, wait a minute, I left the old world for freedom, for complete freedom, to freedom to live as an individual as I want to live, not to be oppressed by somebody else's terms. You can't force me to sign my name to something, to a God I don't believe in. And if you do, I won't sign this document. And the whole thing could have been derailed about this question. Like I say, this was the opening salvo in a unending struggle of religious freedom, what it means to have religious freedom in Israel, and the tension between being a Jewish state and a democratic state. So Ben-Gurion, this is one of his executive decisions, that this was not resolved in committee. He took it home and wrote this paragraph himself. And he put in the phrase Tzur Yisrael, Rock of Israel. What was amazing about that? Well, it's a great compromise, because it's ambiguous enough for somebody could choose for himself or herself what that word means. For a religious person, Tzur Yisrael certainly means God. How do we know that? Perhaps that phrase is familiar to you from various places in the Siddur, like in the morning prayer book, right after Michamocha. You say, Tzur Yisrael, Kuma Bezrat Yisrael. God is called, O Rock of Israel, please arise and defend the people of Israel. And it appears in poetic passages in the Bible. So any religious thinker would say, oh, you know, that's a perfectly good name for God that appears in Jewish liturgy and in Jewish texts. However, a secular person could hear Rock of Israel and say, good, that's a nice euphemism for, I don't know, lots of things. Maybe the land of Israel itself, or the dream of national restoration, or even the people of Israel itself. We've been our rock, you know, for 1,000 years, or however you might choose to explain it. So I think this is an example. There's something kind of inspirational to me about this, that as people fight about religious freedom, it takes great creative minds to say, you know, there's a way that we can all be happy. Sometimes there isn't. But here in this text, the question of religion threatened to derail the whole thing until Ben-Gurion, in his brilliance in this regard, said, how about we say we place our trust in the Rock of Israel, and the reader can determine for herself, what do we mean by the Rock of Israel? So the name of God never actually appears in the declaration, except that it does. It does. It all depends on how you choose to hear Tzur Yisrael, Rock of Israel. By the way, immediately after that, you see all these signatures. And Rabbi Fishman, who was the person who recited the Shechianu, his name is here. In the Hebrew text, after his name, he put this little abbreviation that is common in religious documents. You can't see it in the English translation here, but in his signature next to it, he wrote Beit Hey, which means Bezrat Hashem, which means with God's help, which means thanks to his signature, the name of God did end up appearing in the document anyway. All right, my friends, I'm going to, I just want to share one or two more things about you. Thank you for all of your insights, your questions, your participation in all of that. I'm going to just take a couple more minutes to conclude and to bring some things together. First of all, to conclude the story of the Declaration of Independence, that 7.5 hours after it was signed, the British mandate over Palestine came to an end, and Israel officially came into existence that night at 12 midnight. It was 6 p.m. in Washington, D.C., and 11 minutes later at 6:11 p.m. Eastern Time, the White House released its statement recognizing the provisional government, like that document that I showed you. And soon after that, minutes after that, 2 other foreign governments recognized the state of Israel. That's a good trivia question if you're ever on some weird episode of Jeopardy or something like that, that the United States was the first country to recognize the state after the Declaration of Independence. Who was the second? The second was Guatemala. And the third after Guatemala was the Soviet Union. So I don't know what to make of that, except to say there's a fun and interesting trivia question for you.
Although having been in Guatemala with our mutual friend and
James Eagle, right?
the Guatemalans tell the story that they were the first.
First before Truman, huh? That's what they say. You know, and the other country.
Proudly so, they say that there's controversy that in terms of the timing, but they claim to be the first.
Oh wow, I didn't know that. Oh, that's so interesting. Well, okay, so that's the end of the formal teaching part of the document, but I just want to say a few words by way of conclusion, and that is to say some things about this document, about what we've studied and what this might mean for us today. Clearly, I think that the task of Zionism is unfinished in 2022. Its unfinished task is to strengthen Israel from both without and within, and to help her live up to the lofty ideals that we've read about in this document, in this manic document with the wild story of how it came to be. I hope I convinced you of that part. I do think that reform communities in America have a unique responsibility in the Zionist landscape. Sometimes it feels like voices of extremism, voices of intolerance, they tend to dominate the discourse about Israel, which I think is really unfortunate, because in America, we're the majority of the Zionist community. We're the largest piece of it, but sometimes our voices are diminished. And I think that's unfortunate. I think that's a problem. So I want to share with you just, I think, one more slide of what I think are reform Zionist imperatives that all stem from this conversation that we've had today. And this is the last slide that I'm putting on the screen here for you. First of all, is this idea that everything that we've talked about today, this document, the Declaration of Independence, it's an aspirational document. It's not a description of the status quo. It's easy to read some of those things, especially the paragraph about all the rights that are promised and ensured, and say, oh, well, how come it's not like that in reality? What a disgrace. The whole thing is a failure. But I think you could say the same thing about the United States Constitution and Declaration of Independence as well. I think the important thing to remember is that these are aspirational documents about what, at our highest moments, these communities, these societies are striving to be. And I think the task of a liberal Jewish community is to know this Declaration of Independence and to say that's to try to hold Israel to saying, this is your highest aspiration. This is of what we desire for the society that is constantly in formulation. I would also suggest that our imperative as a Israel-loving community is love, but love that comes with criticism, or criticism that comes with love. Or in other words, I would put it this way. My relationship to Israel is a loving relationship, the way I love my family. When I say it's the way I love my family, it means that my love for that place is unconditional. Like my love for my family is unconditional. That doesn't mean that members of my family don't sometimes let me down, or sometimes I'm disappointed with the choices that they make. And sometimes it is my responsibility, because I'm in this relationship with them, to criticize them when I think they're going wrong. I think the job of a responsible Zionist in America today is to have that loving criticism, the way we have this loving relationship with our family, but always has to be couched in a way of saying, but as family, I'll never abandon you, even when I'm disappointed. The third bullet point on the screen is to show up. What I mean by that is I think it's our responsibility to wear Israel on our sleeves and to not let, I work on a college campus, and that's what I was thinking when I wrote this down on this slide, to say, to not let our opponents, our political opponents, browbeat us into hiding our love and our connection for Israel. Easier said than done sometimes. It's very hard to be pro-Israel on a college campus today. But I think it's more important than ever to be able to say, I won't be browbeaten into hiding my connections to Israel. That's what I mean by showing up. I think we have a unique responsibility to support Reform Jewish institutions in Israel. And I listed some of them on the screen there. ARTSA is the Zionist arm of the American Reform movement. I think we have a responsibility to connect to Israeli Reform congregations and institutions, and support the amazing work of IRAC, the Israel Religious Action Center, which does all sorts of incredible work promoting civil rights and civil liberties for everybody in Israel. We have a responsibility to go to Israel. I am currently, because of this damned pandemic, this is the longest period in my adult life that I've gone without actually being there. And it is just every day something that is wearing on my soul. But that's my suggestion to all of you, to go with Rabbi Lazar on Brit Achim's next trip to Israel, because I think it's very, very important to be going back and forth. Keep learning and keep reading, because the situation is complex. I mean, Israel in 2022 is complex. The situation, the Israeli-Palestinian dilemma is complicated. It's not one-sided, and we have a responsibility to reject demonization or easy answers. I'm thinking of that particularly around the debacle from this past week, around the death and the funeral of the Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, which is just so painful to read about. I think it's important to say it's really complex, these issues, and anyone who says it's simple, there's good guys and bad guys, is probably selling us something. And the last thing I would say is, as religious Jews, we have a responsibility never to lose the longing for this place, that to remember that Israel is this incredible aspiration, but more than that, to remember that you and I live in an unbelievable, incredible time in the unfolding millennia of Jewish history. We live in a time that knows a state of Israel. That's unbelievable from the point of view of our ancestors, of our great-great-grandparents, and our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents. They would say, do you realize how incredible it is that we live in an era that knows a state of Israel? What does that mean for the Jewish souls that we have? What does it mean for our perspective, our understandings of God and religion and Torah, that we happen to be blessed in a generation that knows the state of Israel? So with that, I believe that how about I read one more thing for you as a way of concluding all of these thoughts, and then I'm done. Although if other people want to respond and talk, if you're not too exhausted from all this, that's fine with me. But rather than my words, let's conclude with the words of Theodor Herzl. Herzl, as you know, was the founder of all this. He's cited at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence as the father of the Zionist movement. In 1902, Herzl wrote a novel called Altneu Land, The Old New Land. And it's a terrible novel, but an important one historically. And at the end of the novel, the characters, the plot, the narrative all falls away and he speaks personally. And I think it's the most beautiful part of the book. This is the epilogue of Herzl's Altneu Land. He says, but if you do not wish it, this is Herzl now, like the fourth wall falls and he speaks directly to his audience. All this that I have related to you is and will remain a fable. I had meant to compose an instructive poem. Some will say it contains more poetry than instruction. That it has more instruction than poetry will be the verdict of other readers. Then he goes, now, dear book, after 3 years of labor, we must part and your sufferings will begin. You will have to make your way through enmity and misrepresentation as through a dark forest. And I can't help but imagine that he's talking about not just the book, but this whole movement that he launched to create, that culminates in the creation of a Jewish state. And then he says, when, however, you come among friendly folk, give them greetings from your Father. Tell them that he believes dreams are also a fulfillment of the days of our sojourn on earth. Dreams are not so different from deeds as some may think. All the deeds of men are only dreams at first, and in the end, their deeds dissolve into dreams. Well, my friends, it's been a pleasure being with you today, or being with you today, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to come. I hope we get to meet in person sometime in the not too distant future. And Rhonda or Rabbi Lazar, I'm glad to turn it back over to you. But thanks, everybody. Thanks for being with me today. I'm very grateful.
Thank you.
Yasher Koach and Toda Rabbah, Rabbi.
My pleasure.
Applauding here. I
Thank
guess-
you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad we have the opportunity to meet with you. And even after 2 years, to have a new Zoom experience is amazing. So I don't know if anybody had any questions? Anything? Rabbi, you ready? Oh. To sum it all up?
Yeah, no, just to go back to the first comment that I made when recalling Neil's just amazement with things that happen in life. You know, who wants to sleep? This is too amazing, and to really appreciate the things that happen, recognizing them, sanctifying them, and really making the most out of them. So thank you, my friend, my teacher, my colleague, for being here with us and for inspiring us. This was really, really phenomenal.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, and also thank you to Rhonda and all those who helped to arrange for this to happen. I know you don't just snap your fingers and it appears, but it was a wonderful experience of learning. Thank you, Rabbi Gold.
And I'll be at the CCAR convention in Jerusalem in February, or next year, and trying to think of a good time to do another trip. We had one planned a couple of times that had to be put off, but if anybody's interested in pursuing it even further, just let me know, because I'm trying to.
Interested. I'll come.
Excellent. Anyone who wants to join us, you're welcome.
And I can mention Shehechianu is our family's very favorite prayer. We utter it so many times because so many blessings to be grateful for. Little, big, medium size. It's our favorite prayer.
Amen to that, Lois. It's a good one. It's a good favorite to have.